the mountains of Korea did not forgive mistakes. One wrong movement, one exposed ridgeline, one delayed decision, and entire units could disappear into snow and silence. In this frozen war of endurance, overwhelming power did not always guarantee survival. Speed did not always bring victory. Instead, something quieter began to shape the battlefield. Measured patience, disciplined positioning, calculated restraint. Elite Canadian units developed tactics so precise and sustainable that even larger Allied formations took notice. This is not a story of rivalry. It is a story of battlefield intelligence, of adaptation, and of how strategic discipline in the harshest conditions quietly changed the fight in Korea. Before we continue, if you appreciate cinematic, immersive history, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. Your support keeps these powerful stories alive. Now, step into the mountains. When war erupted on the Korean peninsula in 1950, few understood how brutal the terrain would become. Under the United Nations command, forces from multiple nations deployed to stop aggression and stabilize the region. Among them were American and Canadian troops, fighting side by side under shared objectives. But Korea was not a conventional battlefield. It was a maze of steep ridgelines and narrow valleys. Roads were limited. Visibility was unpredictable. Weather was merciless. Large formations moving aggressively could quickly become stretched thin. A unit that advanced too far risked isolation. Momentum, once considered a powerful weapon, could turn into vulnerability. Canadian commanders understood something critical from earlier wars. In mountains, survival belongs to those who control elevation and conserve strength. Rather than pushing rapidly into exposed valleys, Canadian units often secured defensible high ground first. They studied slopes, they calculated fields of fire, they prepared fallback positions in advance. To some observers, this appeared cautious, but it was calculated. Each defensive perimeter was layered. Machine gun placements overlapped. Mortar positions were pre-registered. Routes for reinforcement were mapped carefully. If pressure increased, they did not panic. They repositioned. Controlled withdrawal was not weakness, it was preparation. When advancing forces encountered unexpected resistance, Canadians sometimes fell back deliberately to secondary fortified ridges. What looked like retreat often funneled opposing forces into pre-planned zones where defensive coordination became decisive. This methodical approach minimized chaos. It preserved manpower. It reduced exposure. Communication in Korea was another challenge. Radios failed in mountainous terrain. Snowstorms interrupted signals. Canadian doctrine empowered junior leaders. Platoon and company officers were trained to act independently if contact with higher command was lost. Decisions were made on the ground, within broader objectives. This flexibility prevented paralysis. Where confusion threatened to spread, small unit leadership maintained cohesion. Then came winter. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Weapons required constant maintenance to function. Frostbite became a constant danger. Canadian units emphasized cold weather discipline, frequent rotation of sentries, layered clothing inspections, defensive positions designed to reduce wind exposure. Preparation became survival. Night attacks through snow tested every element of training. In those moments, discipline, not size, determined outcome. It is important to remember, Canadian and American forces fought together, not against each other. There was no rivalry on the ground, but differences in tactical culture were visible. American formations often operated with larger-scale maneuver doctrine, designed for rapid advances and powerful combined arms operations. Canadian units frequently prioritized sustainability, terrain mastery, and structural defense. In Korea's mountains, sustainability mattered deeply. And gradually, Canadian formations developed a reputation for reliability under extreme pressure. They held their sectors, again and again. But soon, a major confrontation would test this philosophy beyond theory, a battle that would define their legacy. Snow fell without warning. It swallowed footprints. It erased movement. It concealed danger. By the time winter tightened its grip across the Korean hills, the war had shifted from sweeping advances to brutal positional struggle. Front lines hardened along jagged ridges. Every hilltop became a fortress. Every valley became a corridor of risk. In these conditions, elite Canadian units were assigned sectors others considered difficult: steep gradients, limited reinforcement routes, constant pressure. But this was precisely where their tactical discipline began to reveal its strength. Rather than concentrating solely on visible threats, Canadian officers studied patterns. Enemy movements often followed terrain logic. Ridgelines at night, valleys during reduced visibility, probing attacks designed to test weak points before committing larger forces. Instead of reacting emotionally to each probe, Canadian positions were structured to absorb pressure. Forward listening posts were placed beyond the main defensive line, not to fight prolonged battles, but to provide early warning. These outposts were lightly manned, highly alert, and prepared to fall back quickly. Behind them, primary defensive trenches were reinforced with overlapping arcs of fire. Behind those, secondary fallback ridges were prepared in advance. Nothing was accidental. If an enemy assault intensified, the outer layer could yield without collapsing the entire structure. This depth created resilience. One of the most effective elements of their method was fire discipline. In the chaos of night engagements, it was easy for nervous units to exhaust ammunition rapidly, but Canadian units emphasized controlled bursts and pre-measured targeting zones. Mortar teams rehearsed coordinates repeatedly. Machine gunners memorized elevation adjustments. Artillery liaisons prepared contingency maps. When attacks came through darkness and snow, response was not random. It was rehearsed. This precision conserved resources in an environment where resupply was never guaranteed. Supply lines in Korea were fragile. Mountain roads froze. Vehicles stalled. Convoys faced exposure in narrow passes. By limiting unnecessary offensives and avoiding overextension, Canadian units reduced logistical strain. They did not chase temporary gains. They fortified sustainable positions. This sometimes contrasted with larger maneuvers occurring elsewhere along the front, when sectors shifted rapidly. Overstretched units occasionally required urgent stabilization. In more than one instance, Canadian companies were moved into pressured zones not because they were the largest force available, but because they were known for cohesion under stress. Cohesion became their signature. It began at the small unit level. Non-commissioned officers played a crucial role. They maintained morale in freezing trenches. They enforced routine in environments where routine felt impossible. Weapons checks, boot inspections, ammunition counts, quiet encouragement during long, sleepless nights. Discipline was not harshness. It was structure in uncertainty. And structure reduced fear. Another defining strength was observation. Rather than revealing positions unnecessarily, Canadian patrols gathered intelligence patiently. Short reconnaissance missions mapped subtle terrain features. Hidden gullies, frozen stream beds, elevation shadows that could conceal movement. Information shaped defense. When pressure increased along certain approaches, reinforcements were not rushed blindly. They were guided to predetermined support points. This minimized confusion, and in mountainous combat, confusion spreads quickly. Perhaps the most critical advantage, however, was psychological steadiness. Winter warfare magnifies anxiety. Visibility disappears. Sounds distort in wind. Shadows move unpredictably. In such conditions, panic can fracture even well-equipped units. Canadian training emphasized calm under uncertainty. Soldiers were conditioned to expect infiltration attempts. They were taught to rely on structure rather than impulse. If flares illuminated sudden movement, sectors responded in coordinated sequence, not chaotic firing. If communication lines were temporarily lost, fallback protocols were activated automatically. It was not dramatic, but it was effective. Allied observers began noting something consistent. Where terrain was unforgiving, where supply was strained, where pressure was sustained, Canadian positions endured. Again, it was never about proving superiority over allies. American and Canadian forces fought under the same objectives, supported each other, and shared intelligence continuously. But differences in operational tempo and tactical layering created contrast. And in prolonged defensive engagements, layered resilience often proved decisive. As the war settled into a grinding contest of hills and counter-hills, a particular sector would soon become a defining test. A ridgeline contested repeatedly, a position considered vulnerable, a place where discipline would face overwhelming pressure. What happened there would cement the quiet reputation already forming. The mountains were about to decide whether patience could truly withstand force. The ridge did not look important on a map, just another uneven line in a landscape filled with them. But on the ground, it was everything. Whoever controlled the high ground controlled observation. Whoever controlled observation controlled movement. And whoever controlled movement controlled survival. By the time Canadian units rotated into this contested sector, the hill had already seen repeated clashes. Positions had changed hands. Trenches had been carved, abandoned, and reclaimed. The earth itself was scarred from artillery. The assignment was clear. Hold, not advance recklessly. Not overextend. Hold. Canadian commanders began the way they always did, by studying the ground before reshaping it. Engineers reinforced trench walls with sandbags and timber to prevent collapse during bombardment. Firing steps were adjusted for optimal elevation. Communication lines were buried deeper to protect them from shell fragments. Listening posts were extended slightly forward, positioned to detect movement early without drawing unnecessary fire. Nothing was rushed, because rushing in mountains often leads to regret. Patrols moved at dusk and before dawn, mapping subtle elevation shifts. Small depressions that could shield advancing troops were marked. Frozen gullies that could funnel infiltration attempts were identified. The goal was not merely to defend the visible crest. It was to understand every approach. When pressure began to build, it started quietly. Short probing attacks at night, sudden mortar bursts, attempts to test reaction time. The response was measured. Flares were launched in controlled intervals. Machine gun bursts were disciplined, not continuous. Mortar fire was limited to pre-registered zones. There was no waste. When larger assaults followed, the preparation became evident. The outer listening posts withdrew in sequence, not chaos. Signals passed efficiently through buried lines. Reserve squads moved to secondary firing points without confusion. Even under artillery pressure, structure held. Observers later noted that what distinguished this defense was not overwhelming firepower. It was coordination. When one section came under heavier strain, adjacent sections adjusted automatically. Overlapping fields of fire created interlocking protection. It was like gears in a machine. Each movement calculated. Each response anticipated. At one point, heavy shelling temporarily disrupted communication with a forward platoon. In many situations, such a disruption could create uncertainty. But decentralized leadership meant the platoon commander acted without hesitation. Fallback Plan 2 was initiated. Secondary trenches were occupied in orderly sequence. Artillery liaison officers adjusted fire support based on predetermined contingencies. When communication was restored, the line was intact. This was not luck. It was preparation meeting pressure. Weather intensified the challenge. Freezing winds swept across exposed ridges. Snow accumulated in trenches overnight. Weapons required constant maintenance to remain functional. Yet routine never collapsed. Rotations continued. Equipment checks persisted. Morale was reinforced through discipline. In prolonged engagements, psychological endurance becomes as critical as physical defense. Canadian non-commissioned officers ensured that exhaustion did not turn into disorder. Short rest intervals were enforced when possible. Hot rations were prioritized for forward positions whenever supply allowed. These small decisions sustained cohesion. Meanwhile, Allied coordination remained essential. American artillery support often reinforced defensive sectors. Intelligence updates were shared. Strategic planning remained unified. But on this particular ridge, the layered defensive philosophy proved especially effective. Multiple assault attempts were absorbed, not dramatically repelled in sweeping counterattacks. Absorbed. Each wave encountered prepared positions, controlled fire, and fallback layers that prevented breakthrough. Gradually, the pressure decreased, not because the terrain changed, but because the defensive structure made repeated assaults costly and unsustainable. Holding the ridge stabilized the surrounding sector. It prevented further encirclement. It preserved observation over key supply approaches. It demonstrated that patience and structure could withstand repeated force. The reputation that had quietly formed earlier now solidified. Canadian units were increasingly entrusted with difficult defensive assignments, not because they sought attention, but because they delivered stability. In war, stability can be more powerful than dramatic advances. Yet the war itself was far from over. As front lines hardened into static positions, negotiations began in distant rooms. But on the ground, tension remained constant. Truces were discussed, but patrols continued. Artillery remained active. Uncertainty lingered. And in these final phases, discipline would matter more than ever. Because when wars approach stalemate, mistakes often become more dangerous, not less. The mountains were still watching. By the time negotiations began to echo across distant conference tables, the mountains of Korea remained unchanged, cold, unforgiving, unmoved by diplomacy. On the front lines, soldiers could not rely on headlines. They relied on routine. Even as talks of ceasefire circulated, patrols continued beneath dark skies. Defensive lines remained reinforced. Observation posts stayed alert. Because in wars nearing stalemate, complacency becomes the greatest threat. Canadian units understood this well. Their doctrine did not shift with rumors. It remained grounded in structure and sustainability. Trenches were maintained. Fields of fire were recalculated. Communication lines were inspected daily. No one assumed the fighting was finished until orders formally confirmed it. This steadiness preserved stability. During one of the most fragile phases of the conflict, the Korean War had evolved into a contest of endurance. Massive territorial shifts of earlier months had given way to fixed positions along rugged hills. Artillery duels replaced sweeping maneuvers. Patrol clashes replaced broad offensives. In this environment, discipline mattered more than dramatic action. Canadian forces continued to emphasize layered defense and limited exposure. Rather than launching unnecessary advances in uncertain political conditions, they focused on maintaining secure sectors. Observation became crucial. Even minor changes in enemy activity were recorded. Increased movement in one valley, new trench construction across a ridge, adjustments in artillery timing. Nothing was dismissed. Every detail mattered. This meticulous attention prevented surprises during a time when unpredictability was high. Allied coordination remained constant. American and other United Nations forces operated alongside Canadian units, sharing intelligence and supporting broader strategic objectives. Artillery cooperation and logistical planning reflected unified command. There was no separation in purpose, only variation in tactical emphasis. Where some operations relied on large-scale presence, Canadian sectors often demonstrated the quiet strength of structural integrity. Their approach reduced unnecessary risk. It conserved manpower during prolonged deployment. And perhaps most importantly, it provided reliability. Reliability builds trust. As months passed, sectors stabilized further. Defensive lines became more fortified than ever before. Positions that had once changed hands repeatedly now held firm. The harsh Korean winters gradually gave way to less severe seasons. But the terrain remained challenging. Supply routes still required careful management. Ridges still demanded vigilance. But the philosophy never changed. Hold what matters. Prepare for what may come. Act with discipline. When the armistice was finally signed in July 1953, it did not bring dramatic celebration to the front lines. It brought relief. Relief that the hills would no longer erupt with sudden shell fire. Relief that patrols would no longer disappear into uncertainty. Relief that structure and endurance had carried them through. The Korean War did not end with sweeping victory parades. It ended with hardened positions and exhausted soldiers, who had endured some of the most demanding conditions of modern warfare. For Canadian units, the legacy was not defined by bold headlines. It was defined by steadiness, by the ability to adapt to unforgiving terrain, by leadership that empowered small units under pressure, by layered tactics that absorbed force rather than collapsing beneath it, and importantly by cooperation within a broader Allied mission. The story is not one of competition between allies. It is a story of contrast in approach, different doctrines, different rhythms of engagement, different tactical instincts shaped by prior experience. In Korea's mountains, those differences revealed valuable lessons about sustainability in modern conflict. Today, military historians studying the Korean War often emphasize how terrain and climate reshaped 20th century warfare. Mechanized strength alone could not dominate ridgelines. Air power alone could not hold trenches. Endurance required structure. Structure required discipline. And discipline required leadership at every level. The quiet effectiveness demonstrated by Canadian formations during the war continues to be studied as an example of how measured tactics can succeed in extreme conditions. Not dramatic, not loud, but enduring. The mountains of Korea still stand today, silent. But beneath that silence lies the memory of soldiers who held their ground through snow, uncertainty, and sustained pressure. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful victories are not defined by rapid advances, but by the refusal to yield when conditions are harshest. If you found this story powerful and meaningful, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. Your engagement helps keep these untold stories alive. And as always, thank you for stepping into history with us.